the leadership of Dr. Kojo Okonwadie, who is the presenter for tonight. He's going to stimulate creative thinking. Our presenter tonight is popularly known as Prof. or Ras Wiroi. He's an educator, he's a researcher, he's an educationist. He was born in the coastal city of Tema, Ghana. He graduated from the University of Ghana prior to migrating to the United States. Prof. Wiro is a two-time graduate of Columbia College, Chicago, with master's degrees in education and music business. Of University of Illinois at Chicago, where he received his doctorate in education, with specialization in language, literacy, and culture. He's an assistant professor of education at the Elmhurst University near Chicago. So, my lords and empresses, sorry again, my lords, Prof. Wiro will be presenting on the topic Leonard Percival Howell and his articulation of Rastafari as an African framework. So his presentation will be between 45 minutes to an hour. Please, let's, with rapt attention, take notes of most of the submissions he's going to make, so that after 45 minutes, we can engage him with reasonings, comments, questions, and what have you. So I'll hereby invite Prof. Wiro to take the stage. So, my lords, welcome to the Rastafari Reasoning. Prof. Wiro, your members, Ja, Rastafari.
Give thanks, Kofi Asante. I hope everybody can hear me well. Somebody give me a signal.
Yes, my lord.
Yes,
Louder.
All right. So I give thanks for this day. I give thanks for the vibe. I want to give thanks to the president of the Rastafari Council of Ghana, Papa Bosco. I also want to give thanks to Kofi Asante, who has, been working behind the scenes to make sure that, these kind of events come on for all of us, our benefit and for our learning. I want to give thanks to Ras 7 Fireside, who invited me to, be on this platform. I want to give thanks to Ras Gamali, joining in from Bristol, England. Also, Ras Baku, who is broadcasting this event over his radio network. And I want to give thanks to all my family members who tuned in, and most importantly, I want to give thanks to everybody who is tuned in. We're going to get straight into, as Kofi Asante said, the title of this presentation is Leonard Percival Howell and the Articulation of Rastafari as an African Framework. So in order for us to really dig into, we will have to cover some basics. Now, I want to say that when I use the word African in this presentation, it is not limited to people who are born only in the continent of Africa. I'm referring to all the children of Africa worldwide. So if you hear me use the word African, that is in a broad sense. Now, I also want to ask politely if we can mute our background, or everybody just mute their thing so that everybody can be able to hear clearly, and we have a successful event. Leonard Percival Howell, also known as Gonguru Maraj, also known as Gonguru Maraj. Give thanks. Also, the President General of the Ethiopian Salvation Society, and also the founder and president of the King of Kings Mission. Leonard Percival Howell is also known as the first Rasta. Now, the question is Leonard Percival Howell the first Rasta or not? We are going to delve into that. And my answer for that is both yes and no. So we're going to look into that. But before we do that, I want to start with a quotation from The Promised Key by Leonard Howell. And I quote, "Upon His Majesty Rastafari's head are many diadems, and on his garment a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Oh, come, let us adore him, for he is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the conquering Lion of Judah, the elect of God and the light of the world." Leonard Howell, The Promised Key. Now, The Promised Key is a very critical book which shaped the early formation of Rastafari thinking and also practices. I also want to advance two very important quotations that I personally like that, were brought forward by Leonard Howell. And the first is, "Might cannot fight right." And then the second is, "Forward to the King of Kings." So you may be asking a question, who at all is Leonard Howell? And we're going to address that question. But before we do that, let me just say that he was born in Jamaica in 1898. Now, for the purpose of this presentation, there are two things that I want to really address. The first is that Leonard Howell was very intentional in thinking about how to establish Rastafari in an African framework. And then secondly, recently there have been people particularly going around on the internet and elsewhere trying to ascribe origins of Rastafari to India and saying that the African contribution was minimal. And that also will be part of what we're going to be addressing. But before we get into all that, I want to give a little background, a little context as to the kind of things that were going on in the world at the time when Leonard Howell was getting ready to come on the scene. So we have World War I happening between 1914 to 1918, which is a worldwide event. And as we know, in World War I, subjects of the colonies, such as in Ghana, Jamaica, Nigeria, Cameroon, Trinidad, Tobago, were all fighting on behalf of their colonial masters. That was to have a great impact on the movement for emancipation later on, and we're going to talk about that as well. Another event that is of great importance is the opening of the Panama Canal. So the Panama Canal is a canal that was constructed to have ships be able to easily connect around the Americas, as opposed to going all the way down to South America to be able to get onto the other side. Very similar to how the Suez Canal was constructed in Egypt to allow passage of transportation. Another important event that was occurring around 1916 was the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was an Islamic empire that stretched from a greater part of Europe, and it broke up in 1916. So there was a lot of things going on. And then in 1922, we have the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia that brings about the establishment of the Soviet Union. And then on the other side of the world, we look at women's issues. We see women getting a lot of traction in terms of being able to vote in the United States and also worldwide between 1917 and 1922. Now, right after the First World War, we also see the establishment of the League of Nations, which is an organization that was designed to bring the nations of the world together, of which also would have a direct connection to Rastafari later down the line. And we were going to talk about that as well. Another big event that occurred a little bit later was the Great Depression. So the Great Depression, starting in 1929, was a situation where the stock market crashed in the Western world. It resulted in people really getting into hard times, people having to queue just to buy a loaf of bread. I think those of us who were young during the early revolution days in Ghana, we can really relate to that kind of situation where we had to queue. So these things were going on. Now, in terms of the Black world specifically, and in terms of the early conceptualization of Rastafari, we see Marcus Garvey leave Jamaica and come to the United States in 1916 at the invitation of Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was a pioneer educator here in the United States. Now, in 1917, in Africa, in Ethiopia specifically, we also see the crowning of Rastafari as Rast, or what some people would translate as Crown Prince, but is really more Rast. And right after that, in 1924, he takes a tour of European countries. And then in 1919, W.E.B. Du Bois organizes the Pan-Africanist Congress, which was also a major event, and followed by the crowning also of Haile Selassie in 1928 as Negus, or king. Now, all these things taking place in the world. Another critical event was in Ghana. We had J.E. Casely Hayford putting together the National Congress of British West Africa, which was to organize for agitation for independence, also occurring in 1917. Now, all these events are important because they are informing how Black people are going to be moving forward. These events are one side of the coin. The other thing that was really happening was something that was steeped in a movement known as Ethiopianism. So let's take that into context, because Ethiopianism is going to really shape many things down the line. Now, you may ask the question, what was Ethiopianism? Well, what is Ethiopianism? So Ethiopianism is simply a religious and political movement which really began because Blacks in churches, both in Africa and also in the United States and the Caribbean, felt like because of the racism, they weren't getting an opportunity to be able to move up the ladder in the religious circles and also in the political circles. And it resulted in some kind of frustration and discontent. Now, Ethiopianism has been, burgeoning here and there since the 1700s, but it really took off, as we're going to see, in the 1800s. And one of the things that really helped Ethiopianism to really bloom was the Battle of Adwa, 1896, which was, as you already know, decisively won by Emperor Menelik of Ethiopia. So Ethiopianism concerns itself with patriotism for Africans, unity of Africans, concern for other people, etc., etc. Now, Ethiopianism, as I mentioned earlier on, got a major boost in the 1880s from South Africa. South Africa, all of a sudden, saw itself with a lot of Black mission workers advancing the cause of Ethiopianism. So we have churches such as the Tembu Tribal Church, and also the man who actually coined the term was Mokone, Bishop Mokone, who coined the term Ethiopianism from South Africa in 1892. So colonized subjects who had been subjected to Christianity were looking for something that was more authentic, that was more connected and practical to their African beliefs and practices. So Ethiopianism was not limited to the Western world or to South Africa. We see that in Nigeria, we have the first Ethiopian church, the Native Baptist Church, established in 1888. And then we have Cameroon, 1897. Ghana, 1898. We have Zimbabwe, 1906. And then we also have the Church of Christ in Africa, also in Zimbabwe, which was an Ethiopianist church, also established. Now, prior to all this, in 1865, in Jamaica, there were Ethiopianist churches also burgeoning. And this is going to inform a lot of things that we're going to be talking about momentarily. According to the researcher, Professor Robert Hill, they had been in existence, and I quote here from his book, Dread History, prior to the coronation event in Ethiopia in 1930, a considerable tradition of Ethiopianism. Now, interestingly, the first native Baptist church in Jamaica was established by a reverend known as George Lyle, who left the United States from the state of Georgia and established a church in Jamaica in 1783, known as the Ethiopian Baptist Church. So we see that Ethiopianist ideas were going back a far time. But what will be more direct in the shaping of Rastafari ideology and conception has to do with the books that were being published by these Ethiopianist-oriented preachers. One of them is a book known as "A Black Man Will Be the Universal King" by Reverend James Morris Webb from here in Chicago, who published this book around 1919. And he was also a reverend who spoke a lot to the United Negro Improvement Association, UNI. And we've heard a lot of times the whole quote, "Look to Africa for the crown of the Black King," which was actually stated by Martin Garvey. It was first stated by Reverend James Morris Webb, an Ethiopianist preacher, who is also what we would know as a Rastafari. And then the other book that was also instrumental was the Royal Parchment Scrolls of Black Supremacy by Reverend Petersburg. And then thirdly, the Holy Pibi, of which I have a copy somewhere here, by Atlee Rogers, also published in 1924. And then after that, we're going to have in 1935, Leonard Howell publishing his Promise Key. One interesting fact about the Promise Key is that it was actually published out of Accra, Ghana. So, it is an early manifestation of having this Ethiopianist tradition also in Ghana. And as we shall see, the countries with the strongest Ethiopianist traditions were all vying for a place to fight alongside Ethiopia when Ethiopia was attacked by Mussolini in 1935, 1936. Now, these Ethiopianist preachers, particularly in the United States, were advancing certain ideas. For instance, advanced the idea all Black people in the United States needed to give up their American citizenship to take up Ethiopian nationality, because they were not people from the United States, they were African people. And then we have the United Negro Improvement Association under Marcus Garvey, and we see the Reverend Rabbi Ford also writing the what we now know today as the Ethiopian anthem that we all sing during our meetings. Ethiopia, the land of our fathers, the land where God loved to be. Okay, so he wrote that, the original version of that for the UNIA, also in the Ethiopian tradition, and then it was later on adopted by the Ethiopian World Federation and then the Rastafari family at large. I'm moving a little fast because, there's a lot of things I want to cover, and I know Ras Kofi says that there is a limitation with time, so we're going to try to push on. So, having set the tone for the background of the things that were occurring in the world, and particularly in the Black world, we want to ask ourselves, who was Leonard Howell? Leonard Howell, as I said earlier on, is known as the first Rasta. And as I said, I'm going to answer this question. Was he actually the first Rasta? And my answer is going to be yes, but my answer is also going to be no. Now, he was born in Jamaica in the parish of Clarendon. So just as Ghana is divided into regions, in Jamaica there are parishes. So the parish of Clarendon is where Leonard Howell was born, in a village known as Maypro. He was in a family of 10, and he was the eldest of all the 10 children. Now, it is said that as a young man, a big judge in Jamaica had asked him to testify against a man who resided in his community. And Leonard Howell refused to testify because the man had been accused of murder, and Leonard Howell was being asked to come to the court and testify against the man. But he refused to testify. So after the court case, he was advised that if he could find somewhere to, as we say in Ghana, balance to, right, then he should do that. So he left Jamaica at a young age and went to Panama. And as I said earlier on, construction for the Panama Canal and all those things were going on. So a lot of people moved from Jamaica to aid in the construction of the canal. But for Howell, he joined the U.S. Army, right? And he went in Panama for a little while and then, joined the U.S. Army from there and arrived in New York City in 1918. He went for years for the U.S. Army to like around 1923 when he was discharged from the Army. After being discharged from the Army, he set up shop in New York where he established what was known as the tea room. So a tea room was a place where you could go and have a sip of tea, but also it was a place where you could go for different kinds of herbs. Like if you were having any kind of malady, you could go for herbs. So he was selling herbs of, Caribbean origin, herbs of American origin, all of these in the tea room in New York City. During this time, he joined the UNIA. He became very good friends with Marcus Garvey. He actually rose up the ladder in the UNIA. And he also became very good friends with a person who was very instrumental in the independence struggle for Ghana. Now, when I was a young man, I never knew that this person was not even a Ghanaian because of how well entrenched this person is in the struggle for Ghana's independence. And this person was actually originally born in Trinidad and Tobago, and I'm referring to George Padmore, the most honorable. And after I grew up into my teenage years, there's a library, and I'm glad to know that it's still in existence, the George Padmore Library in Accra, that had wonderful selection of black books. I used to go there and just sit down there with my little church money and just devour the books. So George Padmore and Leonard Howell became good friends around this time. Now, this is going to be important down the line. So, Marcus Garvey was deported from the United States in 1927 for Jamaica after having established the UNIA here in the United States. Now, Leonard Howell was to face a similar kind of event a few years down the line in 1932 when he was also deported from the United States to Jamaica. So we can see that here the U.S. government was trying to basically send the people who they considered to be higher up ranks in the UNIA were not of United States origin back to their countries. When Leonard Howell arrived in Jamaica in 1932, the Jamaican government had put a ban, a prohibition on revivalism. So revivalism is simply a movement that, was very strong. It still is in Jamaica, but it was very strong in the 1920s. And it basically was, I'll call it a syncretic movement. That is a movement that was taking Christianity and African practices and beliefs and merging them together, as we have in Vodou in Haiti. And revivalism came out of the native Baptist churches that we talked about earlier on. As for the native Baptist churches, they were more African than Baptist, right? And they didn't even have any missionaries going to areas such as St. Thomas in Jamaica, which we're going to talk about down the line until very much later. So when Leonard Howell came to Jamaica, he started his activities first in Kingston. He was to be arrested 2 years after his arrival in Jamaica and sentenced to 2 years imprisonment. Now, when he came to Jamaica, as I mentioned earlier on, he established the Ethiopian Salvation Society. He started preaching in Kingston. And at that time, Marcus Garvey was also preaching in Kingston. And Marcus Garvey had successfully been able to purchase a place called Idlewild Park and renamed that place Redemption Ground. And that was the park where most of his preaching went on. So Leonard Howell also began preaching in Kingston. But for reasons, he later on moved to St. Thomas. And I particularly am of the conviction that Leonard Howell did not simply choose any parish to go to. He was very intentional about selecting St. Thomas as the parish he was going to go to, and we will talk more about why that is. But after his establishment in St. Thomas Parish, he would move to the adjoining parish, which is St. Catherine. But let's hear from Leonard Howell himself. He gave an interview to the Jamaica Gleaner in November 1940, on November 23rd to be specific. And this is what he said. He said, after subsequent return to the United States, I became attracted to the Rastafarites and afterwards returned home to Jamaica to preach its tenets. So two questions that we want to ask ourselves here. Number one, who were the Rastafarites that he was referring to if he was the first Rasta? And then what were the tenets of the Rastafarites? So as I mentioned earlier on, all these Rastafarites were Reverend James Morris Webb, Reverend Petersburg, Lee Rogers, Grover Redding, etc. And all the tenets that the Rastafari were projecting included the acceptance of an Ethiopian identity, the rejection of white supremacy, the idea that black people should recognize a universal black king, as we see advanced in the teachings of James Morris Webb. The Rastafarites also asked black people to pledge allegiance to the government of Rastafari. Rastafarites advocated for a physical return to Africa and, more importantly, for organization among black people for this to occur. The Rastafarites used Ethiopian flags at their parades and their marches. And also, another tenet was that as a Rastafari, you were supposed to be prepared to die for the freedom of Ethiopia. Now, these were the tenets that Leonard Howell was referring to, that he was introduced to by the Rastafari, that he came back home to Jamaica to preach. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, Leonard Howell began preaching in Kingston, Jamaica. But after a while, he left Kingston for the parish of St. Thomas. Here, he would be greatly welcomed. Not that he wasn't welcome in Kingston, he was, but his preaching was very much embraced in the parish of St. Thomas. But at the same time, the colonial authorities were not happy with him, and they were sending police people anytime he preached to go and record every word that he said. And he was very much aware of that. But he was also intentional. For instance, he called King George a vagabond. Imagine, being under the colonial system and being raised at your parades to be consistently referring to the King of England as a vagabond. Now, he sold the pictures of His Majesty, Rastafari, to his followers. And so initially when the colonial government were looking for something to pin him on, to arrest him, they came up with this whole thing that he was selling pictures to Jamaicans and telling them that once they bought a picture, that would serve as their passport for them to go to Ethiopia. But far from the truth, as he said earlier on, he was advancing the tenets of the Rastafarites, and one of those tenets is the use of the picture of Rastafari. So that was one of the ways that he was generating funds for his organizations. Now, it is also important for us to look at why the parish of St. Thomas. in Jamaica was very conducive to the early blossoming of Leonard Howell and by extension Rastafari's activities. Even to this day in Jamaica, and the whole Jamaica is African, but St. Thomas is really like a stronghold of African retention, even to this day. And this is so because even after the abolition of slavery in Jamaica, the slave master decided to move slavery to a different phase. And this phase was the phase of indentured servitude. So in other words, we're bringing in workers from other places in the world. So they brought people from China, they brought people in from India, but they also brought in people from what we call today the Congo region, right? And this includes countries such as Angola, Republic of Congo, and Democratic Republic of Congo, and all these places around the Congo River. This continued for a very long time, well into the 1840s. And because of that, these new entrants into Jamaica were coming in with a strong infusion of Congo practices, Congo ideology, Congo ways of thinking, which remains to this day, right? We look at Jamaica, for instance, St. Thomas, stronghold of Kumina to this day, right? Kumina is a drumming and dancing, also originating from the Congo region. And so in the colonial times, the practices that were originating from this Congo region were all classified under the banner of Mayalism. So Mayalism was the original, which was later on transfused into revivalism. And then revivalism, as we're going to see later on, also informed directly Rastafari ideas and practices. So St. Thomas really welcomed Leonard Howell. He began to preach in St. Thomas. He was having crowds every time he was preaching. He became very well established there. And he would later move on to the adjoining parish of St. Catherine, where he would establish a Rastafari commune known as Pinnacle. Howell was married to a lady known as Tenet Howell. Now, it is important to elevate the name of Tenet Howell because she played a very critical role in the establishment of Pinnacle. Now, what am I referring to? So Leonard Howell, after putting together his savings and having donations from people who wanted to see the establishment of Pinnacle and his followers, went to his wife and said, you know what, we want to buy this piece of land. We have such and such. We need a little bit more. And Tenet Howell actually was the one who sold her jewelry and put the money towards the establishment of Pinnacle. Now, the followers of Leonard Howell say that the land was about 1,500 acres, even though the government of Jamaica is trying to claim that it was more around 300 acres. But I think that the consensus is that it was at least a 500-acre piece of land, which is now under contention because they're trying to claim that Leonard Howell didn't have the papers, even though there are counter arguments to that he actually did have the papers, that the papers are existed, but the government of Jamaica has somehow found a way to sell majority of the land that belonged to Leonard Howell to a real estate developer in St. Catherine. So Leonard Howell, I don't know exactly the number of children that he had, but I know at least 3 of them having met them. So when Leonard Howell left the parish of St. Thomas, he purchased this land in the adjoining state or the adjoining parish, which is St. Catherine, and established Pinnacle as a commune. Now, a lot of activities were going on at Pinnacle. Mind you, at the same time, Leonard Howell was running the Ethiopian Salvation Society. And all the things that were going on at Pinnacle, the activities included farming, right? They were greatly into farming, and also ganja farming, right? But agricultural and, ganja farming. They were also known for pounding rocks because, where the Pinnacle is situated is a rocky place. So they were pounding rocks into gravel, which also was a way of generating income. They made clothing, right? They made clothing for themselves and also for their society at large. They were known for building houses. They established a school on the grounds of Pinnacle. And together with the Ethiopian Salvation Society, established by Leonard Howell, they also had a bakery on site at Pinnacle, but also had 11 other bakeries in town, in Kingston and all around Jamaica, which were generating income for Pinnacle. So Pinnacle was not just a commune where Rasta people were just sitting down there and blazing chalice all day long. It was an incubator of entrepreneurship for Rastafari at a very early stage, but a hub, I would say, that spread on ecological consciousness because they were also promoting that idea, and also African pride, but most importantly, political action. Now, I want us to now, having set the tone, listen to a little bit of history about Leonard Howell, look at the roads. I want us to be more specific and look at his message. What message did Leonard Howell deliver, and to who was he delivering this message to? It is important for me to point out that when Leonard Howell came to Africa, the trade unions were appealing mostly to the working class people. Like they were looking at the working class people. Nobody was appealing to the peasant, the farmer. And so Leonard Howell was very intentional about directing his energy to the portion of the society which had been rejected, the peasants. And that's who made up the majority of the peasantry were also the African people. So Leonard Howell's message was that the time has come for Black people to, quote unquote, change the guard. And I'm going to use some quotation from Leonard Howell. The first quotation from Howell. He says, and I quote, "Ethiopia is the succeeding kingdom of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Our philosopher is the Anglo-Saxon kingdom's philosopher's successor, a wide-awake universal mastermind." Then Howell also says that upon the crown of His Majesty are many diadems. Now, he interpreted this specifically to align with the idea that we always espouse in Rastafari, that upon the coronation of His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie I the First, 72 different nations bowed to him. Now, Leonard Howell was saying that, look, upon the crown of His Majesty are many diadems. He was also saying that now that His Majesty has been crowned, any king in the world is subject to the crown of His Majesty because he's the one who has the many diadems on his crown. So, Leonard Howell also was strategic about his preaching. What he did was he would put side-by-side photographs of the third son of King George. Now, it is important, this third son of King George was the one who was sent by King George of England to go and represent him in Ethiopia at the coronation of His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie I. So, Leonard Howell would put a picture of this third son of King George alongside a picture of His Majesty Rastafari and show it to the people and say, who would you rather follow? You want to follow this weakling who is the third son of King George, or would you rather follow the King of Kings, Emperor Rastafari of Ethiopia? So Howell was basically signaling to the black world that the white world's time was coming to an end, and that the time had come for the black world to rise. And if we look in the Promised King, again, I'm going to use a quotation from chapter 1 of the Promised King that Howell used in making this point. He says, the Duke, that is the third son of King George, who was sent to represent King George at the coronation of His Majesty. And I quote, the Duke fell down, bending knees before His Majesty Rastafari, King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and spoke in a loud voice and said, Master, Master, my father has sent me to represent himself. He's unable to come, and he said that he will serve you to the end, Master. So, Leonard Howell used this quotation to show that even the person that you are worshipping as your colonial master is serving this King of Kings in Ethiopia. So why don't you, and this King of Kings in Ethiopia is your king, black people. So why don't you let go this King George of England and embrace your king, the King of Ethiopia? Now, it did not end there. So if anybody is trying to put across the idea maybe that Leonard Howell was basically advancing some kind of idea on the religious plane, that is only partly the case. Leonard Howell was also advancing a very political idea. In fact, he said if anybody had any kind of grievance, that grievance should not be reported to King George of England or any of his representatives. They should write a letter to His Majesty Rastafari, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And not only that, Leonard Howell also worked on the psychology of black Jamaicans. And what do I mean by this? He said, I know our mothers used to tell us this. So for instance, in Ghana, when Ghana was under colonial rule, the anthem was God Save the King or God Save the Queen, right? So Leonard Howell basically told black Jamaicans, he said, you know what? Continue to sing the anthem, God Save the King. But as you sing that anthem, do not imagine that you're singing it to King George of England. You are singing that anthem to King Rastafari of Ethiopia. So again, he was creating a psychological shift out of the colonial mentality into a more emancipated mindset for black Jamaicans. And another important thing that Leonard Howell did was that he told black Jamaicans to stop paying taxes to the colonial government. So this was one important point in his platform. Do not send no money to England. Let us use the money for the benefit of black people. Now, another thing that Leonard Howell did was also to look at the gifts that were sent by King George of England to Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia during the coronation. And here I'm going to use a quotation from Leonard Howell himself. He looked at the gifts and made a case. He says, the Duke handed to His Majesty Rastafari, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, a scepter of solid gold, 27 inches long, of which had been taken from the hands of Ethiopia some 1,000 years ago. This magnificent piece of workmanship, which had inscribed on one side, Ethiopia shall make her hands reach unto God, and on the other side, King of Kings of Ethiopia. Now, why was this important for Leonard Howell to emphasize? He was saying that, look, even the King of England, King George, has sent this scepter back to its original owner, the King of Ethiopia, to signal that Ethiopia, the black people of the world at this time, are stretching forth their hands unto God. And that indeed, their king, King Rastafari, King Haile Selassie, is the black king of the entire world. And he also made the point again that even the colonial king, King George, is bowing to King Haile Selassie. So what are you waiting for, black people? It is the black man's time. Now, as you can imagine, these ideas did not sit well with the colonial government in Jamaica. They began to plot as to how they were going to destabilize the activities of Leonard Howell. Now, they raided Pinnacle 3 times. I'm going to talk about that momentarily. But before that, remember we talked about Leonard Howell after the establishment of the Ethiopian Salvation Society, being arrested and sentenced to 2 years in prison after he was released. Now, during his trial, he's also noted as the first person in Jamaica to declare His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie I as the returned Messiah to the earth. And this occurred in the Moran Bay courthouse in the parish of St. Thomas in Jamaica, the first one. Now,
turn off your camera.
Say it again. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought somebody was saying something. At this point, as I mentioned earlier on, Leonard Howell was intentional about selecting the parish of St. Thomas as the crucible of his early activities. One second. I better take a seat. And that was very intentional because he was going to create an idea which was to embrace the African practices that were in Jamaican society. So, according to the research of Professor Robert Hill, this, in its early stage, Rastafari possessed a close and organic link with the belief and ritual systems of Jamaican folk religion. Now here, when they say Jamaican folk religion, they're basically saying African religion. So why is this important? As I mentioned earlier on, the continuous supply of indentured servants from the Angola-Congo region to the parish of St. Thomas, which is on the eastern side of Jamaica, made it so that these practices were always fresh in the minds of the people. So how do we these belief systems and these African practices? The first is the embrace of Kumina. So in Pinnacle, the drumming and dancing that took place were directly Kumina. Kumina is the dancing and practices of the Congo Angola people who were very present in the parish of St. Thomas. Now, Kumina also had a feature which allowed the Africans who were practitioners to go into trance. So this was also occurring in Pinnacle. Something else was that when Howell established the Ethiopian Salvation Society, there had been prior to that a Jamaican preacher, a native Baptist preacher, an Ethiopian, passed up, and his followers all moved to join Leonard Howell in his early formation. It is also important to know that people began to as own way in their own churches, separate from what Leonard Howell was advancing the Rastafari. And they refer to His Majesty Haile Selassie as Nzambi Mpungu, which is the name for the divine in Bakongo religion. Apart from Kumina, we had what was referred to as the Poko churches, the Pokomania churches, who also began after the coronation, some of them declaring Haile Selassie as God after the coronation. And then we see the idea of always Howell referring to the black god and black goddess, the black king and black queen, the Alpha, King Alpha and Omega, right? Now, having established Pinnacle and having advanced these ideas, there are also some African ideas that were to become central to the early conception of Rastafari. And the first one I would like to talk about is the centrality of Africa to Rastafari thought. This was something that was established in Pinnacle by Leonard Howell and his early followers. Now remember, Jamaica was populated by people from all parts of Africa. But the major groups of people that populated Jamaica were the Congo. And when we say Congo, we're referring to people, again, from Angola, Congo region, the area of the Congo River, the Akan people, the Yoruba people, who are referred to as Nago, still in Jamaica, the Fon and Ewe people of Ghana, Togo, those polities were not in existence back then, but in that region. And then also the Ibibio and also the Igbo peoples of Nigeria. This determination is made based on ship records that the slave masters left behind, but also words that are present in Jamaican language that come from these groups of people that are still in use today. So for instance, in Jamaica, and also in a lot of proverbs, there's a lot of proverbs from all these groups of people still in use in Jamaica. But when we hear a word such as patu in Jamaica, which is the owl, right? Referring to the same name is used by Akan people in Ghana, patu as owl. When we hear bisi in Jamaica as the kola nut, right? We can determine is coming down from bisi, as we say in Ghana, which is also the kola nut. So the idea of Africa as central to Rastafari ideology is advanced by Leonard Howell Pinnacle. Now, the second idea that I want to put forward is the idea of divine kingship. So this idea of divine kingship is a very much African idea coming to us from ancient Kemet, coming to us from ancient Nubia, coming to us from even contemporary African societies. We have this idea of divine kingship. And Leonard Howell continued to project this idea, projecting His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie as the divine king. Another idea that was alien to the colonial doctrine and orientation is the human as a divine person. This is an idea also that was a continuity that was advanced by Leonard Howell. The human is a divine person. We are part of the Creator, so we cannot be, as they say in some religions, that we are born in sin. We are not born in no sin. We are divine spark from the beginning. And if we cast our minds back to ancient Kemet and look at the Hosea says that we come on earth as humans to perfect our character. So we don't come here to be born in sin and to live in sin, but to come here as divine, also along the way perfect our character. Now, at Pinnacle, Leonard Howell also and his followers also advanced the idea of the use of herbs in healing, right? So Pinnacle was also what they call in Jamaican folklore a balm yard, where people go for divination and also people go for healing. Now, Leonard Howell also advanced the idea of communalism, living together. And we still see these elements in certain aspects of Rastafari, right? And in fact, when he was interviewed one time, he said he was establishing Pinnacle so that he will be able to, quote unquote, live a socialistic life. In other words, he was looking forward to a liberty which brought the black people, he and his followers together, and which generated income for the benefit of all. And it's important for me to point out, and well, maybe I'll point this out later on. But the next thing I'm going to talk about is the continuity that Rastafari has in terms of practices related to menstruation. So these practices were also actualized in Pinnacle. And these were also continuities that were coming from the African continent. Even to this day, for instance, when we take the Akan people, for instance, when a woman is at that time of the month, they say that she has gone behind the house, or caught a picture, which means that in very ancient times, there was seclusion where the woman actually went and lived in a secluded house during that time, because the idea, which is still very much alive today, is that the menstrual blood is very powerful. In fact, it is, to my knowledge, used even in making certain powerful medicine. And it is so powerful that at that time, the woman was asked to seclude herself because she could not cook for her husband. She could not even in the marketplace pass over certain people's wares and all this kind of stuff, or touch objects that are ritual objects, or even fetch water from the stream. So the whole idea of Rastafari having certain practices regarding menstruation was also a very much African idea that was, continued in Pinnacle by Leonard Howell. And again, even as I was talking about this whole thing, because of this, if you look at the Ghana people in Ghana, for instance, in older times, the married man and the married woman were not necessarily staying in the same house, right? Because there was this belief that the menstrual blood was so powerful that if it came near the war medicines, it will render the war medicines powerless. So the woman stayed in her own house, and then the men stayed also in their own house, and they would go over and visit the women in these houses. Now, another very important point, which unfortunately I hear, I've heard, is being ascribed to the Indians, which could be not further from the truth, is the idea of the ritualized smoking of herb. Now, let me state here categorically that yes, the Indians use herb, ganja, marijuana, whatever you call it, but they only ingested it orally. That is, they only drank it or ate it. It was the people from the Congo region who smoked the herb. And this is why, even though the herb is known as Indian hemp, it is also known as Congo tobacco. They were the first to smoke the herb in pipes. And this can be confirmed by the research of Chris Duval, by the research of Maureen Warner Lewis, by the research of Shula Bilby, etc. The people around the Congo region were the first to use pipes to smoke herb. And not only that, they were also the ones who would block a prayer, so to speak, before smoking the herb. So this is also a continuity that Leonard Howell maintained in his early formation of Rastafari ideology. Now, we can also see Congo names for herb in Jamaican language today. So names such as Diamba is a word of Congolese origin. A word such as Makonje, which is a name for ganja, is of Congolese origin. A word such as Maka, Congolese origin. A word such as Kaya, Congolese origin. Okay? So we should not try to minimize Africa's contribution to the formation of Rastafari. Rastafari is an African thing. And Leonard Howell was very intentional about this in the early days. Now, let's talk about Lux. Majority of the people at Pinnacle were not Lux men or Lux women. But it is pointed out that the security at Pinnacle were always Lux men. The people who guarded Pinnacle were always people who were Lux. Now, why is this important? This is also important because these days we hear people going around talking about Rastafari learned how to wear Lux from India. How is that possible? Now, Rastafari, black people everywhere at any point in time in our history, there have always been Lux in our midst. We have, from ancient Kemet, we have rulers who were fully in their Lux. As we, even to this day, we look at a society like the Yoruba in Nigeria, we have the whole concept of Dada, which are children who are born and whose hair is not cut, right? We can look at, even among Akan societies, what we call Bijnaba, which is a child who is born whose hair is not cut and the locks are maintained. There are different priests and priestesses, traditional priests and priestesses who wear locks in all African societies. So what are the chances that you would be looking at a very foreign society which had very tiny populations on the island of Jamaica to replicate a practice, as opposed to looking at a population which was majority in Jamaica and which you were very intentional about in terms of establishing and continuing their practices, right? So Lux also becomes a part of Rastafari identity, and this was also a continuity that was advanced by Leonard Howell. So when we look at the 6 dimensions of African nation building, we realize that Leonard Howell implemented every single one of these dimensions. Now, the first dimension of nation building is the production of food, agriculture. It is said that the people and Pinnacle produced so much food that they not only were feeding themselves, but they were also supplying the markets in Sligoville and surrounding areas of St. Catherine. The second dimension of nation building is the establishment of health system. By his establishment of barnyard and using herbs for healing, Leonard Howell also advanced this idea. The third is defense and security. The whole idea where Rastafari, anytime we're having gatherings, we always want to make sure there's security at the gate or people at the gate. That is an idea that is also coming from Pinnacle, right? Where we have people represent security. So this is an aspect of African nation building also advanced at Pinnacle, the importance of defense to our nation. Of course, as we learned earlier on, the people at Pinnacle were also house builders, building houses, providing houses. And I wish we were on a platform that we could actually see some pictures of Pinnacle. Like if you see the pictures of Pinnacle in the architecture, is exactly the construction of an African village that was put forward over there. And as we learned earlier on, the other dimensions of African nation building are clothing. The people at Pinnacle were known for not only designing and making clothes, but also working leather, making shoes and leather product, belts, all these kind of things, and selling them to the public, which is another dimension of African nation building. And finally, education. As we learned earlier on, Leonard Howell and his followers established a school at Pinnacle. And so by looking at these, we see that Leonard Howell established and met all the dimensions of African nation building. Now, Roscoe, how am I doing on time? All right, since I hear him right now, so which means I have more time on this. But I want to conclude by talking about Leonard Howell, the leader. So I want us to dispel from our mind that maybe Leonard Howell was some kind of small leader who was confined to some marginal sections of Jamaican society. That is far from the truth. I'm going to begin here with a quote from D.A. Dunkley, his research. He says, Howell participated in renewing the optimism of Black Jamaicans with his promise of liberation from oppressive British colonialism and white supremacy. As I mentioned earlier on, when Howell came back to Jamaica, nobody was preaching or even concerned about the peasants. He was the one who reached out to the peasants. Bustamante and Manley were appealing to the working class people, and they were trade unionists, so the working class was their main audience. But Howell was the one who appealed directly to the peasantry. Now, later on, we'll see that Bustamante will also prove to be the one who had the greatest aggression and opposition to Leonard Howell. He would be the one who ordered Jamaican constabulary to raid Pinnacle and set it on fire in 1954, after having tried unsuccessfully in 1941, where they raided Pinnacle and came under the guise that Leonard Howell was shielding somebody who was wanted. But, they came, they scattered the people out of Pinnacle, people came right back. So 1954, they went, they burnt the whole place down. Most of the people left, but some came right back. And then they went again in 1958 to move the vestiges of those who had remained. So Howell was not a leader who was confined just to one section of Jamaican society. He was very much visible on the political front in Jamaica. And he offered the people an alternative to the Creole nationalism that was being advanced by Bustamante and also by Norman Manley. He said, you people are not Creoles, you are Africans. You need to look to Africa. This is what we need. Howell told the Black Jamaicans not to trust the trade unions. And he was of the concept, the idea that Jamaica should not follow the pattern that would create a national identity for the country upon its independence, which unfortunately independence was achieved under Bustamante, and therefore the identity of Jamaica became more of a Creole national identity as opposed to the African identity that Leonard Howell proposed and espoused. Now, because of this, Howell was greatly persecuted. In fact, Ras Miguel Lorne, who is a very prominent attorney, Rastafari attorney in Jamaica, says that to date, Leonard Howell remained the most persecuted and persecuted Rastafari. And I would submit to that, because Leonard Howell was arrested more than 50 times, even when he was in his 70s. The colonial government and even the new government that assumed independence, of course working for the colonial master, hadn't forgiven him for even being bold enough to ask Africans to look to Africa in Jamaica. Even when Leonard Howell left the community and went to live in a cave, they still came there to come and arrest him, and always putting all these frivolous charges against him. But Leonard Howell was unstoppable. And because of his unstoppable nature, even after the dispersal of Pinnacle, when most of the people in Pinnacle moved into other parts of Jamaica and into Kingston, into areas such as Bakawal, from which a lot of the formations that we know as Rastafari organizations today would begin to spring up. Talking about, Bobo Shanti, EWF, and all these other organizations, those were vestiges of Howell's population, Howell's followers. And therefore, his unstoppable nature is directly responsible for Rastafari going beyond the boundaries of Jamaica and even into the worldwide black, world. Now, it is important that Leonard Howell, in addition to being a man of action, a political leader, also was a citizen to lead black people. It is often said that if you want to lead black people, you need to have some kind of around you. So yes, Leonard Howell, and that's why he adopted the mystic name that he used in publishing the Promise Key Ganguru Mirage, which his followers added another gun. Africans, we always like to emphasize certain things to make the thing more potent. So the name evolved from Ganguru Mirage to Ganguru Mirage, right? And he used that name as his mystical name. But one thing that also was very appealing to the followers of Leonard Howell about him was that he was not just talking and doing these things. He was directly using his organization to improve the lives of the members of his organization. So when he formed the Ethiopian Salvation Society, he was making sure that all the members who were contributing their little money, who were running the bakeries, who were running the farms, who were pounding the rocks into gravel, their lives were directly improved as a result of these economic activities. He was very intentional about that. And I think that's something that all of us should emulate. And talking about emulation, some things that we can learn from Leonard Howell. Number one is his perseverance. He never gave up, even to the very last day. He stood. And when we hear Bob Marley being referred to as the tough gun, that is actually paying tribute to the original gun, Leonard Gangonguru Mirage Howell. Now, Howell also upheld the liberty and the practices of Africa, which is something that we need to also learn from him. He always advanced the notion of unity, even when it was very difficult for him. Even when, for instance, he and Marcus Garvey had certain disagreement, he never publicly came out and chastised Marcus Garvey for those disagreements. Because when Howell first came back to the United States, he and Marcus Garvey would meet and have lunch on a weekly basis. But when he started pushing the Rastafari ideology, there was a little bit of tension between him and Garvey, who felt that, Jamaicans who were dealing with things such as Pocomania and Kumina, where, that was not a civilized way, as he would put it. It was more like doing a black version of Orthodox Christianity, and Howell wasn't having any of that. But in all that, he did not come out and say, I'm disbanding the ideas of Marcus Garvey. To the contrary, he actually projected and promoted, alongside Marcus Garvey, these ideas of black empowerment and black advancement. So it is important that we embrace the cultural values of Africa and also the practices within Rastafari liberty. Now, I want to end by reading a quotation from Leonard Howell. And this is from a poster. And again, this was printed and posted all around Jamaica. Now, in those colonial days, HMS or OHMS simply stood for On His Majesty's Service, which was referring to His Majesty, the King of England. But Leonard Howell took that and changed that to mean On His Majesty's Service, the King of Ethiopia. So, Leonard Howell says, On His Majesty's Service, King of Kings and Lord of Lords of Ethiopia, black people, arise and shine, for the light is come, and the glory of the Lord is risen upon thee. Let all generations of Ethiopia hear the voice of Leonard P. Howell, for in his hands the Lord is given. Let not the preachers of Babylon persuade you to turn your back against the Lord God of Ethiopia. Woe be unto the people of a race who seek not their own foundation. Your wives shall be servants for the wives of other men, and their daughters shall be wolves of poor men. Shall be wives of poor men and of vagabonds, and there shall be tears because of privation. I strongly appeal to you to seek and learn of your own foundation. Woe be unto a race of people who forsake their own doctrine for another. They shall be slaves to the people thereof. O people of Ethiopia, boast not of the progress of the white man, believing that you are a part of the project. You will be cast over the bridge of death, both body and soul. Generation of Ethiopia, I, Leonard P. Howell, speak unto you. For as the Lord God of Ethiopia liveth, this is a very serious affair and must not be forsaken. The white men gave the black men the wrong doctrine. They told them to condemn silver and gold and seek heaven after death. But now, we the black men have found out their trick. We found that the writers of the story was a clique. All their intention was to make themselves strong. Under the white man's doctrine, the black man slights the things in life, seeketh heaven after death. It has brought us salvation to starve, live in disgrace, and die in dishonor. They that refuse the Ethiopian doctrine now shall find no other, but slavery and oppression shall overcome them. So for these words, I give thanks, and I'm willing to take some questions if there is time. Give thanks.